Mrs. Wilson, unfamiliar with air travel, was initially bewildered upon arriving at the airport. She observed a group of travelers rushing to board their flight and decided to follow them, assuming they knew what to do. Coming from a small town, the airport seemed like a remarkable and even mythical place to her. Despite putting on her best clothes for the trip, she was mistaken for a low-income individual as the metal detectors at the doorframe reacted to the key she kept in her shoe, a habit she had formed to avoid losing it. To the surprise of the check-in counter worker, Mrs. Wilson was holding a business-class ticket. Unfortunately, she almost missed her flight due to following the wrong group of passengers, but was saved by the kindness of an airport employee who directed her to the correct departure zone, where some passengers were already boarding. The man gave Mrs. Wilson a smile and guided her to the designated gate on her boarding pass, warning her not to get lost again. Mrs. Wilson fidgeted with her purse, glancing at her watch anxiously. A young man with a business-class ticket approached and asked, "Is this your first time on a plane?" Mrs. Wilson, trembling with excitement, replied, "Yes, it's my first time. I'm really worried." As the boarding process began, the flight attendants politely invited the passengers to board the plane through the boarding bridge, taking Mrs. Wilson's boarding pass. The flight attendant then led her to her seat. However, the man sitting next to her was displeased to find Mrs. Wilson as his seatmate. He put down his magazine and asked, "This is business class, isn't it? Why should I pay extra to be seated next to an old beggar like her?" The flight attendant tried to defuse the situation, saying, "Mr. Thompson, please calm down. Mrs. Wilson has the exact same type of ticket as you can see on her boarding pass. Please, take a look." "I don't want to look at anything," the rude man said, raising his voice and still refusing to give up his seat next to Mrs. Wilson. The elderly woman watched the argument nervously, not daring to speak up. The other passengers were divided, with some sympathizing with Mrs. Wilson and others opposing her presence in business class. One of her supporters was the young man she had spoken to while waiting to board the flight, who could not tolerate the man's behavior. He stood up for her and said, "Come on, Mrs. Wilson is much older than you and yet you're acting like a complete lowlife, making her stand while you lounge comfortably in your seat." The young man's words caused Mr. Thompson to become visibly embarrassed and he quieted down. However, the outcry among the business class passengers continued to escalate. The flight attendant, unable to control the situation, looked pleadingly at Mrs. Wilson. Realizing she was the cause of the scandal, Mrs. Wilson sighed and said, "Oh, well, never mind. Let's not argue. I'll move to economy class," Mrs. Wilson said with tears in her eyes, feeling like her life had lost its purpose. As the other passengers watched, Mr. Thompson realized his mistake and put the magazine aside. "Take your seat, Mrs. Wilson. You paid for it and it's rightfully yours," he said, stepping aside. Mrs. Wilson, too emotional to speak, sat down, and as she did, her handbag opened and a picture fell out. Mr. Thompson picked it up and saw it was a photo of a young boy. "Is this important to you?" he asked kindly, handing her the photo. Mrs. Wilson took it with care, a smile spreading across her face as she looked at it. "Yes," she said, "that's my son. He's a pilot." Dorothy Wilson told her story to the now attentive business class passengers. Growing up in a poor family with 4 siblings, she and her parents, Kate and John, ran a small farm to get by. As the oldest child, Dorothy carried some of the burden of raising her younger siblings, including Peter, who was mentally challenged. When World War II broke out, John joined the army and fought in the Pacific Islands. Before leaving, he gave Dorothy a family heirloom passed down from his grandfather and asked her to keep it safe until his return. Sadly, John returned in a coffin and the Wilson family was left to grieve the loss of their breadwinner and head of the family. After John's death, Dorothy's mother never recovered and never remarried. As time passed, Dorothy grew older and was faced with the challenge of starting her own family. However, she chose to stay with her mother and help care for her mentally challenged brother, Peter, as her 2 other siblings had moved to a larger city. Despite this, she later met her true love, Jack, who was a handsome shepherd driving his flock to new pastures. Their relationship developed quickly and they were planning their wedding, but fate had other plans. Tragically, Peter set their house on fire, and both Jack and Peter lost their lives while trying to save Peter. The loss left Dorothy and her mother homeless, and they were forced to live in an old shack purchased with the money from selling Jack's sheep. It was then that Dorothy discovered she was pregnant. Sadly, by that point, her mother was already showing signs of dementia, including aggressive behavior. Kate had even tried to attack her pregnant daughter with a knife on more than one occasion, blaming all of her troubles on Dorothy. Despite these challenges, Dorothy gave birth to a beautiful baby boy, but was constantly worried that her mother could harm him. After 3 years of living in fear, she made the difficult decision to place her son in an orphanage, believing he would be better. After her mother's death, Dorothy returned to the orphanage to reclaim her son, only to learn that he had been adopted. She spent many years searching for him, but only recently was she able to find him. The passengers aboard the plane were moved by Mrs. Wilson's story. She had finally been reunited with her son, who was flying the plane they were on, through the help of a volunteer organization. On her 85th birthday, she saw her son for the first time in many years. Overcome with emotion, she stated that she could now die peacefully knowing that her son was doing well. The story had a profound impact on some of the passengers, who re-evaluated their own lives. The flight attendant even went to speak with the pilot, and a few minutes later, the announcement came over the intercom. The captain spoke to the passengers, reminding them that life is full of ups and downs, but that we should not compare ourselves to others, as every person is given different opportunities from birth. It all depends on how we choose to use them. It's through our mistakes that we learn the joy of forgiveness. Let's not seek blame where there is none and refrain from harboring resentment towards those we may not understand. I would also like to express my love and admiration for my mother, who is on this flight with me today. I have long forgiven her, and she is a truly good person who deserves to be cherished. The pilot's words touched the hearts of the passengers, and they erupted in applause. Upon landing, Mrs. Wilson was finally reunited with her son after many years, and they embraced each other through tears of happiness. The old woman presented her son with a golden halo, which she had kept safe all these years. Kevin was overcome with emotion and cried like a child as he held the precious heirloom. The long-awaited reunion was a dream come true for both mother and son.